You are looking at the richest skyline on Earth. The year is 1931, and at the center of it stands the tallest thing human beings have ever built. It is finished, the lights are on, and 3/4 of it is empty. Not empty for a season, while the leases came in. Empty for years. Floor after floor of offices with nobody in them in the most famous building in the world. New Yorkers gave it a name that stuck for 2 decades. They called it the Empty State Building. This is the story of how the tallest building on the planet went up in the worst year of the American century, and of the city underneath it, where, at the bottom of it, 1 in every 3 workers had no job at all. Both of those things are the 1930s. We only ever look at one of them. The race to the sky did not begin in the Depression. It began in the boom. In the late 20s, money in New York had nowhere to go but up. Rival towers went into design at the same moment, each one meant to be the tallest on Earth, and the men behind them watched each other steal, the way you would watch a rival's hand of cards. The Chrysler Building won the first round by cheating. Its architect had a 125-foot spire built in secret inside the frame of the building. When the rival tower at 40 Wall Street topped out, Chrysler raised its hidden spire through the roof, 4 sections, 90 minutes, and finished 119 feet taller. The date they raised it was the 23rd of October, 1929. The market broke the next day. And here is the part that gets forgotten. The Empire State Building was not begun before the crash. Ground was broken on the 17th of March, 1930, 5 months after it. The steel was ordered. The men were hired. Wall Street was in ruins, and the city put up the tallest building in the world anyway, on the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, where a hotel had stood. 3,400 workers built it. At full speed, the steel frame rose 4.5 stories in a single week. In one stretch of 22 days, they erected 22 floors. There has never been anything quite like that pace before or since, and it was not achieved by machines. It was achieved by men who did not stop. The steel was joined by 38 riveting gangs. A gang was 2 riveters, a heater and a bucker-up with a helper or 2, 4 or 5 men working as one organism. The heater cooked the rivet until it glowed and threw it, sometimes across an open floor, and it was caught in a tin can and driven home while it was still soft. On the street below, crowds stopped to watch them do it. They were Irish and Italian immigrants, and a sizable minority were Mohawk ironworkers from Conowake, near Montreal, for whom high steel had become a family trade. There was no safety line worth the name. They walked beams a few inches wide, 1/4 of a mile above 5th Avenue, sat down on them to eat lunch, and went back to work. The official count of deaths on the job was 5. 13.5 months from the first shovel to the ribbon, 410 days, 102 floors, 1,250 feet to the roof. It cost just under $41 million, and it came in under budget, which tells you exactly what kind of year it was. In 1930 and 31, steel was cheap, contracts were desperate, and labor was cheapest of all. The greatest building of the age was a bargain, and the reason it was a bargain was the catastrophe going on around it. There was one more thing at the top. The last 100 feet were not offices. They were a mooring mast, a dock for airships. The plan was that dirigibles would tie up at the summit of the building and passengers would walk out onto a gangplank 1,250 feet above Manhattan. It never worked. The wind at that height tore at everything. The only airship that ever managed a connection was a private one in September of 1931, which held on for about 3 minutes in 40-mile-an-hour wind and then let go. The tallest building in the world was finished with a dock for a form of transport that was about to vanish. It is the most 1930s fact there is. On the 1st of May, 1931, President Hoover pressed a button in Washington, and the lights came on in New York. Al Smith stood at the Fifth Avenue entrance. Former governor of New York, the man who had run for president 3 years earlier and lost, now the public face and leasing agent of the tallest building on earth. His 2 grandchildren cut the ribbon. And then, almost nothing happened. 75% of the building was empty on the day it opened. Not 15%, not a slow start. 3/4 of the tallest structure on the planet had never held a desk and would not hold one for years. John J. Raskob, the financier behind it, put his own money in to keep the doors open. By 1935, the building was losing about $1 million a year. What kept it alive was not business. It was the view. $1 bought a ticket to the 86th floor, and through the worst decade in American economic history, people paid it. They came up out of a city that was falling apart to look at it from above. By 1938, the observatory was taking in at least $1 million a year, as much as every rented office in the entire tower put together. Read that again. The most famous office building in the world stayed solvent by selling tickets to look down at a city that could not afford to rent it. And in 1933, a film put a giant ape on top of it, and the whole world learned the shape of a building that was still, floor after floor, unoccupied. Because this is what the view actually was. In 1931, roughly 640,000 New Yorkers were out of work, more than 1 in 10 of every man, woman, and child in the city. By April of that year, the municipal estimate had risen to 750,000 people who ordinarily worked and now did not. By 1933, 1 in 3 workers in New York City had no job at all. The national rate that year was 25%. The richest city in the country was doing worse than the country. It had begun at a bank counter. On the 11th of December, 1930, the Bank of United States failed. It was a Manhattan bank with more than 60 branches across the city. The bank of garment workers, of immigrants, of small shopkeepers. Between the 17th of October and the day it shut its doors, its deposits fell from $212 million to $160. The clearinghouse offered the depositors a loan of half of what was already theirs. Historians have called it the first domino of the collapse. By March of 1933, the banks were shut nationwide, and shopkeepers wrote signs like these in their windows: "Never mind the holiday, we will trust you. You don't need money. What have you got? We will take anything." In February of 1931, the city helped 30,000 families, 60% more than the year before. By 1932, there were as many as 82 bread lines running in New York. Not 82 meals. 82 lines, standing in the street every day. And on empty lots across Manhattan, men built villages out of scrap lumber and packing crates. The most famous of them stood on the drained floor of the old lower reservoir in Central Park, and the city called it what it called all of them, a Hooverville. The newspapers noticed something about the men living in them. A great many were bricklayers, stone masons, and carpenters. They were the trades that had built the luxury apartment houses standing along the edge of that same park, the buildings they could see from the doors of their shanties. They had put up the skyline. Then they built a shack in its shadow out of what was left over. And still the city moved. That is the part the numbers never tell you. The subways ran, the ferries crossed, the parades came up Fifth Avenue, and the crowds turned out to watch them. 40,000 people marched on St. Patrick's Day in 1936, in a city where a third of the workforce had recently been idle. In 1933, New York elected Fiorello LaGuardia, who had campaigned in Italian, Yiddish, and English. He spent the next decade prying federal money out of Washington and pouring it into the 5 boroughs, and you can still drive on the result. The Triborough Bridge opened in 1936, 7 years of construction, 2,800 men on the job. The airport that carries his name was built by the Works Progress Administration between 1937 and 1939. Men who had been standing in the bread lines were handed a shovel and a wage, and we can still watch them at it, because the government filmed its own workers, which is the only reason the labor of the poor in this decade was ever photographed at all. Above all of it, the tower stood, mostly unrented, its lights burning at the top of a city that could not fill it. The Empire State Building did not fill up in the 30s. It took a world war and the boom that came after it. It was not fully leased until 1951. It did not turn a profit until the early 1950s, 20 years after the ribbon was cut. That same year, 1951, it sold for $50 million, the highest price ever paid for a single structure. So the picture you carry of 1930s New York, the skyline, the nerve, the arrow pointing up, is true. It is just not the whole frame. 1 decade, 10 square miles. The tallest building in the world with almost nobody inside it, and the men who built it standing in a line for bread a few blocks away. Neither of those is the exception. They are the same photograph, taken from 2 different heights. They were here. They raised a mountain of steel in 410 days, in a year when almost none of them could have afforded 1 floor of it. And it is still standing. Every rivet in it was driven by somebody who had no idea whether the city was ever coming back. If their story stayed with you, subscribe to Lost and Found Archives and help keep them from being forgotten. New faces from before living memory.